Intel's back, baby. This is the Asus Zenbook S14. This laptop is stellar, and truthfully, Asus has been knocking it out of the park with all their laptops as of late. I do have another Asus laptop review, which is their Tough series, which is their value-oriented gaming laptop, and I've been doing that, and that's been kind of getting pushed in the back burner because of specifically this particular laptop is using Intel's latest chip, their Lunarlake series. This one has 32 gigabytes of RAM. Now, what's specific and special about the RAM for these newer Intel Lunarlake chips is memory is on the package itself. So they only have two different flavors of 16 gigs and 32 gigs. This particular model here I'm running is the 32 gigabyte model, and specifically it's the 258V Lunarlake version. Very quickly, let's go ahead and just kind of talk about what you can get from Intel's side and what the differences are between the 258V and the 288V. Largely, there is no difference between these two chipsets. The 258V and the 288V basically share the same platform. The only difference is that the 288V clocks higher on both the CPU and the GPU. If we take a look at the CPU side, the clocks will boost up an additional 300 megahertz, so the difference between 4.8 gigahertz and 5.1 gigahertz as a max turbo frequency. And then if we take a look at the GPU side, again, they're all basically the same, the only difference here being a 100 megahertz difference on the GPU. Now, it should be noted that we are thermally constrained on this device, so you're not going to really be able to take it much higher than 28 watts. And within 28 watt, you're not going to be able to achieve max clocks on the CPU and GPU at the same time. Nor will you be able to achieve max clocks on the CPU just by itself. I mean, really, you're not. When we do one core at its max frequency, we're already using around 15 watt. That's for one core. There are 4 P cores and 4 E cores on this. In no uncertain terms will you be able to get max clocks on all cores at all inside of 28 watts. So when you compare that and think about that realistically, the 288V doesn't mean anything because they're both going to be constrained thermally inside of that power ceiling. So if you were going to be shopping for a Lunarlake laptop and you were considering the 288V versus the 258V, I would just get the 258V with 32 gigs of RAM. That's going to be the best bang for your buck, the most value, because truthfully, the 288V is not going to show you any performance improvements unless you have a lot of thermal headroom, a giant heatsink that can use all that power. Otherwise, it's going to go to waste. So any money you put in there isn't well worth it. The other specs worth talking about is Asus's continued use of their excellent OLED displays. This features their 14-inch 3K panel, which is 2880 by 1800. So it's a 16 by 10 aspect ratio. With regards to talking about the panel itself, I have been a huge fan and vocal supporter of Asus's efforts into their OLED displays as of late. They are truly amazing, and really you need to see them in person. Inside of this video where I'm recording it and then it's going through YouTube compression and ultimately whatever display you're looking at it is not a correct way to look at these displays. I would very much encourage you, if you have the means and ability, to go to like Best Buy, which they should have. Some Asus laptops, their latest generation, have a lot of variety of different OLED displays that they have on their latest generation stuff. They really do need to be seen to be believed. So I would just say that their OLED panels are just fantastic. Those are the big ticket specs that I think a lot of people typically want to look at when they look at laptops. Obviously, it has a bunch of other things that are really nice going for it, like the Ceraluminum lid. It's just aluminum, but they do this process to get this matte-like coating that is fingerprint resistant. Otherwise, it's all aluminum. It's 2.5 pounds, outrageously light, exactly what you would expect out of an Ultrabook. It's even ultralight, 2.5 pounds, with a 72 watt-hour battery, which is insane and gives you fantastic battery life, which we're going to show you in just a moment. But there's other accoutrements as well. So we have Thunderbolt for another USB-C port. Both of these are capable of charging. 3.5 millimeter audio, 2.1 on HDMI, and then a full USB 3.1 USB-A port. So fair enough on ports. It probably could do a little bit more, but fine enough for what you would expect for most premium Ultrabooks that are out there today, and backlit keyboard as well. So that's pretty much the specs of it. Let's jump into battery life. Now, I only did one type of battery life test on here, and this is a max battery life. What I am doing here is just 4K video playback, which obviously is going to be leveraging the decoding process that's on the chip itself. So we're really going to be idling from the SoC point of view. But I still think that when we take a look at this animated graph, when we take a look at the red line, you can see that we're going to easily clear 15 hours. But more importantly, in this animated part, you can see the amount of power that we're using on the package as well as total system power. And you can see that package power is 1.6 watt pretty much throughout the entirety, and total system power is basically 4.8 watt on average. This will get us to about 15 hours on that 72 watt hour battery. That is sensational. And more to the point, what I'm doing when I show you this is that the display is on at half brightness. So that includes power for the panel itself. That is really good battery life. I think on average, what you should anticipate is around 9 to 10 hours of battery life, generally speaking. Now, if I were to gun this system and do full power, which is about 28 watt, if I was to do that, you're going to be looking at closer to 2 hours of battery life. So if you were looking to push this device to its absolute max, it's going to be a little bit north of 2 hours, which, is going to be something that is far less than 15 hours, but that is a worst case scenario, right? That's like if we're pushing it to its absolute max. That's the range that we're looking at, 15 hours to basically like 2 hours and 10 minutes. Very quickly, talking about standby time that you can expect on this, I honestly was hoping for a bit better, especially because we were going to have that new memory on package design for Intel Lunarlake, where memory is going to be on the package itself. Unfortunately, it looks like we have the same standby issues that it plagues all Windows laptops as it is. Now, Asus does a thing where they will do a hibernate assist mode, where it sees that if it's using a lot of power in standby mode, it will automatically slip into hibernate for you automatically. Now, when you hibernate, it actually fully powers down the system and everything in RAM gets written to disk. And when it powers back up, everything from RAM gets written back to disk. So it's not an immediate return to standby time. Now, even inside of these confinements, even inside these limitations where I have this assist mode on here, in a 12-hour look at standby time, we still used basically 10% of the battery, which is around 8 watt hour from the battery with inside of 12 hours. That is really not a great showing and something that I really wish that they did better. CPU benchmarks, we're going to take a look at Cinebench R23 in 2024. Looking at our Cinebench R23 benchmark scores, we can see a multi-core CPU score of 9,742, which isn't very high. But if we take a look at our single-threaded single-core score, we see 1782, which is actually very, very good. Insofar as if you just take a look at the single core score, it's still very good, but for how little power it's using, it's actually very excellent. Let's take a look at Cinebench R2024 real quick. Taking a look at Cinebench 2024, we can take a look at our multi-core score is 594, and this isn't really very good. The real part that we need to talk about is the single core score, which is 120 points. This is actually a sensational single-threaded score, especially when we learn that the single-threaded results is only taking 15 watts for the processor, the single-core processor, to achieve that result. When we compare this to AMD Strix Point, their Zen 5 mobile part on the HX3070, we can see that we're getting a single-core score of 110 points. However, we're using around 23 watts on average. So if we just take a look at the single-threaded score, the single-threaded speeds on Intel's Lunarlake versus AMD Strix Point, what we're seeing is that we're getting around a 10% performance boost on Intel Lunarlake. However, we're using 8 watts less. That is huge. We're getting better performance on single-threaded and using sensationally less power. That is something that really needs to be talked about because Intel's Lunarlake is showing up really good here. Before we get into the gaming benchmarks, we do need to talk about Intel's general driver problems that still plague the system today. What's interesting is that on Meteorlake, when I first looked at Meteorlake on the Claw, Intel's Batman Arkham Knight didn't run at all. And in fact, when they were able to fix that later on through drivers where it would just run. What we're finding is now on Lunarlake, once again, I'm having the same exact problems happening where Batman Arkham Knight just will not run without any type of fix applied. So this is another situation where I have to wait again for Intel to fix their drivers just to be able to play a game, which was already fixed previously. So there's a disconnect here with what's going on, but it could just be that this is still early sample, so we don't have the latest and greatest drivers that are joined together for Lunarlake, which is potentially just the case, and I'm using preview drivers here. So hopefully it's just a preview driver issue and latest drivers fix Batman Arkham Knight. But even outside of that, even on latest drivers issues, when we take a look at games like Returnal, even though it's running fantastic, there are still some issues, generally speaking, with the fog that we're seeing here. On AMD processors and AMD GPUs, what we're seeing is that that fog is far more translucent. So whatever alpha stuff is there is actually being conveyed. And on Intel stuff, it's just this very opaque fog that's there, which is not accurate image quality. Like if we're talking about just image quality here, it's not the best. And this is, again, something that Intel just generally needs to fix. All this to say that Intel is behind the 8 ball on the driver situation still to this day. They are making good progress, except that I'm not able to test everything. I've only noticed it in Batman Arkham Knight and Returnal. There's also other games, like newer games I've seen with like Ragnarok on other Intel D GPUs, where it's just not performing very well. Starfield still has a problem compared to AMD GPUs in terms of just general performance. So there's still little things that Intel needs to fix on the driver side. More to the point, game developers need access to it to get better results generally. So let's go ahead and jump into the gaming benchmarks. We're going to be comparing Lunarlake to Meteorlake generally, and then we're going to be comparing Lunarlake to AMD, both their older stuff like the Z1E, if we were to take a look at it from Lunarlake being on handhelds, as well as Strix Point, and comparing them and seeing how well they do. The first set of gaming benchmarks that we'll be comparing Intel's Lunarlake, this being the 258V version, versus Intel's previous generation, which would be Meteorlake, specifically the 155H. On that particular model, I was using the MSI Claw, but I got the latest updated one. So that's from around September 1st, the beginning of this month. So everything is up to date as possible on that particular chipset. So we'll be comparing them to that. There are also some slight variances in TDP. I did 15, 20, and 25 watt on Meteorlake because I can directly control it. On the Asus laptop that I have, I'm using Asus to kind of cater power, and they do 12 watt, 17 watt, and 28 watt. It's still kind of within scope. It's not the best, but Lunarlake is doing better even using less wattage. So I still think that it's a good showing for Lunarlake. So let's compare this first. Up first, we're going to take a look at Cyberpunk 2077. This is 720p native. There is no upscaling, and I am using the Steam Deck preset. So if we compare Lunarlake 12 watt to Meteorlake at 15 watt, we can see that we're getting around 50% better averages, still using 3 less watts. Even on our 1 percentile, it is significantly better at 2.4 times better than Meteorlake, even using 3 less watts. So at low wattage, this is a really good showing for Intel Lunarlake. We're looking at almost playable 30 FPS with 720p Steam Deck preset on Cyberpunk 2077. That is really good result. Moving up to the next bracket, we'll take a look at Lunarlake at 17 watt versus the 155H at 20 watt. And again, Lunarlake with 3 less watts is still outperforming Meteorlake. On our averages, we're looking around 14% better. On our 1 percentile, it's around 35% better. And our 0.1 percentile is about 57% better. So 3 less watts and considerably better. At 17 watt, in this particular setting, at 17 watt, we're looking at comfortably playing Cyberpunk 2077 at Steam Deck presets at 720p. We can push a little bit further, going up to 28 watt. Now we're going to be using 3 watts more on Lunarlake, but our averages are around 24% better. Our 1 percentile is 37% better, and our 0.1 percentile is basically 2 times better. So a gigantic difference between these two GPUs from the 155H to Lunarlake. So literally one generation. Intel has largely fixed a lot of the problems on their GPU side. They still do have some driver problems that will have been noted already in this video, but it's already looking a lot better for Lunarlake. So let's go ahead to the next game. And the next game that we'll be taking a look at is Horizon Zero Dawn. This is 720p using the favorite performance preset. And here we see a stark difference. I mean, just take a look at this. Our 15 watt on the MSI Claw is absolutely atrocious. It's really terrible. But at 20 watt on the 155H, we are basically still doing a little bit worse than 12 watt on Lunarlake. So comparing 20 watt on Meteorlake versus 12 watt on Lunarlake, we're getting basically same on averages, but our 1 percentile is a bit better, 20% better on Lunarlake, and around 14-15% better on our 0.1 percentile on 12 watt. So an 8 watt difference, and Lunarlake is still cleaning up. When we go up to 17 watt on Lunarlake versus 25 watt on 155H, so an 8 watt difference, we're seeing that the 155H is around 19% better, 19% better on 1 percentile, as well as 38% better on 0.1 percentile. But the MSI Claw would be using 8 more watts. If we were to compare 28 watt Lunarlake versus 25 watt Meteorlake, Lunarlake is around 13% better on averages, 10% better on 1 percentile, and 7% better on 0.1 percentile. This particular game is much, much better on AMD, and I'll even compare it to like the Ally X, so the previous generation AMD, not even Strix Point, just so you can see how much further ahead AMD is on this particular game, that there's just kind of a pretty stark difference between the two. Let's go and look at the next game. And the next game we're going to be taking a look at is Metro Exodus. This is high settings and 720p. These particular settings that I'm using aren't ideal for actual playable settings. You would really need to go to actually lower resolutions and also low settings. These particular settings are very brutal, and it's very, very punishing on GPUs, and something that I wanted to have so that I can kind of look back as newer APUs come along to see how much progress we've made as time goes on. When we take a look at Meteorlake versus Lunarlake, now again, Meteorlake has 3 more watts going into it, but Lunarlake is still winning. We're at Lunarlake at 12 watt versus Meteorlake at 15 watt. We're around 26% better on averages. Our 1 percentile is 42% better, and our 0.1 percentile is almost 2 times better. This is a core idea that I want you to take away from this, is that Lunarlake fixes a lot of things with Meteorlake, insofar as Meteorlake took a lot of power just to get anything done, and Lunarlake fixes a lot of that. So it's very efficient across the board and does really good work with the power it's given. Bumping it up to the next power scope, we're looking at Meteorlake at 20 watt versus Lunarlake at 17 watt. We do see that averages on Meteorlake are better. We're looking at Meteorlake being 17% better on averages. However, things change when we take a look at 1 percentile and 0.1 percentile. On Lunarlake, we're looking at an 18% increase on 1 percentile and 50% increase on 0.1 percentile. So far better frame pacing on Lunarlake, even though it's using less wattage. And that is a really good showing. Overall, I would say that Lunarlake, when you were to like just eyeball it, it would be far more smooth overall. And this is really where Lunarlake stands out. Bumping up wattage to 25 watt on Meteorlake and 28 watt on Lunarlake, we see that Lunarlake is around 40% better on averages, 37% better on 1 percentile, and only on 0.1 percentile, it's only around 10% better. So in these two particular instances, we're seeing that just pushing a lot of power into it isn't really helping us, and we are going to get a lot of frame stutter here. But for what it's worth, AMD suffers just as well in this particular setting. We'll take a look at that versus Strix Point later on, but let's get to the next game for right now. The next game we'll be looking at is Red Dead Redemption 2. This is 720p native, no upscaling, and the lowest settings possible. To ensure that you have the lowest settings possible, there is a slider that they use. In the event that it's already all the way to the left, you're going to want to make sure that you just like nudge it over a little bit and push it back to the left. This will ensure all the settings are as low as they possibly can be. Now, historically, Red Dead Redemption 2 has always been really good on Intel drivers. Intel has seemingly optimized drivers for Red Dead Redemption 2. It just always seemed to be really good, especially when we're comparing even initial Intel G drivers versus like AMD Renoir. It was always very performant. So comparing MSI Claw, the MSI Claw or Meteorlake 155H versus Lunarlake at 12 watt and 15 watt, Lunarlake is doing a sensationally great job here. Lunarlake at 12 watt versus Meteorlake at 15 watt is around 68% better on averages. On our 1 percentile, it's over 2 times better, and our 0.1 percentile is over 2 times better as well. So a really fantastic result there, that we're using 3 less watts and we're getting sensationally better performance. Inside of this scope, Intel Lunarlake 258V at 12 watt, you can comfortably play with very playable settings with real good frame pacing at 30 FPS. This is going to be 40 FPS average, but you can have a very consistent 30 FPS gameplay at 12 watts. That's a great showing. When we bump up power, Meteorlake needs 20 and 25 watt just to compete with 17 watts. So we'll compare Meteorlake at 25 watt versus Intel Lunarlake at 17 watts. So 8 less watts, and we're basically the same. That's a huge, like, I mean, look at that. 25 watt Meteorlake versus 17 watt Lunarlake. They're basically the same in terms of performance. Like, they're literally the same thing, but we're using 8 less watts on Lunarlake. That's a great showing. Bumping up power to 28 watt on Lunarlake, we can see that 25 watt compared to 28 watt, we're looking 30% better on averages, 27% better on 1 percentile, and around 16% better on 0.1 percentile. So Lunarlake is doing a fantastic job here over Meteorlake. A clear win in terms of just a single generation of how much better Lunarlake is versus Meteorlake. So we'll go to the last game that we're going to be comparing, Meteorlake versus Lunarlake here, and that's going to be Returnal. And the last game we'll be taking a look at is Returnal. Again, I'm using 720p. However, I am using upscaling here because this game is terribly demanding on GPUs. And I often say this, but I love including this in my benchmark roundup. It is using FSR2 balance to upscale to 720p, and I'm using low settings, the lowest settings possible. So if we compare 15 watt Meteorlake to 12 watt Lunarlake, we can see that 12 watt Lunarlake is almost 80% better on averages, 4 times better on 1 percentile, and almost 5 times better on 0.1 percentile. So this really just paints a picture on how bad Meteorlake was, right? Like, Meteorlake was terrible, and Lunarlake is finally at a place where it's competitive with whatever everything else is. So that's a really good showing by Lunarlake. This is almost playable settings at 12 watt for Returnal, which is excellent to see. And then when we take a look again, if we bump up 20 and 25 watt, we're seeing that once again, 25 watt Meteorlake is almost similar to 17 watt Lunarlake. So if we compare just these two right here, this bracket right here, if we take a look at 25 watt Meteorlake, 17 watt Lunarlake is around 8% better on averages. We do lose on 1 percentile and 0.1 percentile, so let's take a look at that. Meteorlake is around 18% better on 0.1 percentile, and it's reversed again for 0.1 percentile, so it's 8% better on Lunarlake. So it's kind of a weird mix there, but generally speaking, Lunarlake at 17 watt will be what Meteorlake is at 25 watts. So that's a really good showing. However, when we go up to 28 watt on Lunarlake compared to 25 watt on Meteorlake, we're looking at 25% better on averages, 14% better on 1 percentile, and 46% better on 0.1 percentile. For Cyberpunk 2077, I'm running at 720p with the Steam Deck preset and no upscaling. Again, the same as I was looking at for the Intel benchmarks. In this particular instance, I am going to be comparing the Ally X in this one instance with Lunarlake, only because on Strix Point, the launch day benchmarks that I have for it were so out of whack that they paint a really weird picture, and I don't have Strix Point updated benches to really compare. So we'll be comparing the Z1E to Lunarlake here. And when we take a look at our 15 watt and 12 watt, we can see that Intel Lunarlake at 12 watt is really good here. And for what it's worth, Intel's Lunarlake at 12 watt will be using less total system power. So Lunarlake is doing very good here. So Lunarlake is around 9% better on averages. However, it suffers a bit on 1 percentile, with the Ally X being about 6% better on 1 percentile. And the Ally X is around 17% better on 0.1 percentile as well. Still, this is a really good showing from Lunarlake at 12 watt versus 15 watt on the Ally X. Going up in wattage, 17 watt to Lunarlake versus 20 watt on the Ally X. On averages, it's pretty much the same. However, 1 percentile is 18% better on the Ally X, and 1 percentile, 0.1 percentile is around 33% better. But now we're using 3 watts less on Lunarlake, and also in total system power, it's significantly less wattage here, around like 6 to 7 watts less total system power. So where Lunarlake stands comparatively in this, it's comparable. It's like really good. It's in terms of how Lunarlake compares to this is actually on point. When we take a look at 25 watt versus 28 watt on Lunarlake, we can see on averages Lunarlake at 28 watt is around 20% better. Our 1 percentile is basically the same, and 0.1 percentile, the Ally X at 25 watt is actually a little bit better, around 10% better. Overall, holistically, when we take a look at this, we can see that Lunarlake versus AMD stuff is roughly similar. So this is just kind of showing that both of these APUs, where they are right now, I would wager dollars to donuts that the reason that we're not seeing any better performance, especially at the higher end, is memory bandwidth limitations. And that is largely it. And especially if we just take a look at the averages, we're just taking a look at the difference between 7500 megatransfers versus 8533 megatransfers on Intel side. So that is largely where that picture looks. But still, really solid results between the both of them. You're kind of 6 in one hand, half a dozen in the other. Really good either or in either case. Horizon Zero Dawn is a game that just favors running on AMD hardware. This is one that really highlights how much better it runs. Starfield is also another one that just runs better on AMD stuff versus Intel. But when we take a look at this, Horizon Zero Dawn 720p favorite performance, I'm going to be comparing Lunarlake versus the Z1E that's found in the Asus ROG Ally X and the Asus ROG Ally. But just to give you a point here, I'm not even comparing Lunarlake to Strix Point. I'm not even comparing Lunarlake to Hawk Point. I'm comparing it to the 7840U variant to Z1E, which is Phoenix Point. So it's 2 generations ago that this is from AMD side. So this is one instance where AMD is just clearing where Intel is right now. And we can honestly just compare 28 watt on Lunarlake versus 15 watt on the Ally X. And even at 28 watt, we can see that it's still 32% better on averages on 15 watt on the Ally X, 24% better on 1 percentile, and 25% better on 0.1 percentile. So there's a clear difference in how much power is being used in these two situations, but AMD is still clearing the situation. We don't even have to look at anything else. If we compare 28 watt to 25 watt, it's almost 2 times better on averages, 80% better on 1 percentile, and 93% better on 0.1 percentile. Just clearing away generationally better for this one particular game on AMD's older stuff, not even Strix Point. So that's where Intel really needs to kind of bridge the divide, where we still have generalized driver issues that we can more or less point as the problem. And we say driver issues, not even just Intel doing driver things. We also have to take a look at it from the side from developers doing work to try to make things better on Intel hardware. So Lunarlake is probably the first hardware that we're taking a look at where Intel can now seed out hardware and say, hey, we finally have something good enough. Can you please just take a look at this? Likely with the MSI AI 8 Claw, the new Claw that's coming out would be a great handheld to give to developers from Intel side. I personally believe to help sell, game developers making Intel stuff better. So that's Horizon Zero Dawn, and it just does a lot better on AMD stuff. The next game to compare Lunarlake with AMD stuff will be Metro Exodus 720p high settings. I am going to be comparing this to Strix Point in this particular instance. So at Strix Point, the HX3070 versus Lunarlake at 12 watt for each of them, we can see that Lunarlake is around 11% better on averages, 36% better on 1 percentile, and almost 2 times better on 0.1 percentile. So Lunarlake is really doing a fantastic job here inside of these scopes, and Lunarlake should be using less total system power than Strix Point is. So this is a really good result from Lunarlake, showing the better performance on memory bandwidth as well as how strong the GPU is generally. 17 watt on Lunarlake versus 18 watt on the HX3070. We can see that the HX3070 gets a tremendous bump, and on the HX3070, just that 1 watt difference, we're looking at a 63% better on averages. On our 1 percentile is 20% better for the Strix Point. However, our 0.1 percentile is 20% better on Lunarlake. So this is a really interesting turn insofar as how power is being divvied between both of these, and Lunarlake is doing a far better job at lower wattages versus Strix Point at lower wattages. And we see kind of a reversal where they kind of are head to head. So much insofar as the GPU can get fed properly at 18 watt versus 17 watt versus at 12 watt. When we go up to 33 watt on Strix Point versus 28 watt on Lunarlake, we see that Lunarlake is still around 11% better. However, our 1 percentile and 0.1 percentile, things get a little fudgy here, and our 1 percentile is only 5% better on Lunarlake. However, our 0.1 percentile is 2 times better on Strix Point. Now, ultimately, no matter which way we look at this, even when we're pushing a lot of wattage, these particular settings are very demanding. And in none of these particular instances is the game what I would deem playable. On 1 percentile is really where I would look at this stuff, where I want to kind of say is a comfortable playable setting. We want to hit at least 30 FPS. In this specific instance, now high settings is not be something that you would want to play. You'd actually want to do lower settings and possibly lower resolution. But Lunarlake is looking like a fairly competent part here compared to what AMD sits. And largely what we're looking at now is both Lunarlake and AMD, Intel and AMD are in such a position where their GPUs are more than strong enough, and the thing that's mostly holding us back is going to be memory bandwidth. And that's going to be the next step that we really need to take for the next generation, and we're likely not to see an improvement until LPDDR6 or like Strix Halo, which is going to have 256-bit wide memory. And the last game that we'll be comparing is Returnal. This is 720p. We are using FSR2 balance to upscale to 720p and low settings. The thing is, even with these lower resolutions and low settings, the game is still outrageously demanding on GPUs. And so far as GPU demanding games go, Returnal does an excellent job of stressing the GPU portion, insofar as we can really clock down the CPU clock speeds and not really see that big of a change in frame rate at all. It's so dependent on needing GPU. So what we're looking at here is such a clear GPU-oriented test. So when we take a look at 12 watt versus 12 watt, so 12 watt Strix Point, the HX3070 versus Lunarlake, the 258V, we're seeing that Lunarlake is actually still doing better. On 12 watt versus 12 watt, our averages on Lunarlake are around 19% better on averages, 19% better on 0.1 percentile, and 25% better on 0.1 percentile. So a clear win for Lunarlake in this very GPU-oriented test. When we go to 17 watt for both of these platforms on Strix Point, the HX3070 versus the 258V, we're seeing on averages are more or less the same. On our 1 percentile, it's more or less the same. And 0.1 percentile, it's about 10% better on Lunarlake. So a really interesting result is that, again, what we're seeing here is that when Strix Point gets more power, more than 12 watt, we're now at a point where the GPU is able to do more work essentially inside of its scope with all the CPUs that are in the background. Lunarlake is doing a much better job distributing power at low power than Strix Point is. And when we go to 33 watt for Strix Point or 28 watt for Lunarlake, you can see that Lunarlake is still around 4% better on averages, 10% better on 1 percentile, and 7% better on 0.1 percentile. A clear win for Lunarlake here, pretty much across at all wattages, right? So not only is Intel Lunarlake doing sensational at low power, it's doing really well with maximizing how much GPU it's giving at low power, but it's also scaling very well at high power and doing better than Strix Point is, even with 5 watts less. Now, it should be noted here that even if we were to put Intel Lunarlake to 33 watts, generally speaking, we're pretty much going to have the same thing. At this point, we're stressing the memory bandwidth limitations on the platforms. And what we're seeing here clearly is when we take a look at the averages, what is it? It's a 5% difference, 10% difference on 1 percentile, 7% difference. I would wager that what we're actually looking at here is the memory bandwidth performance increase on Lunarlake versus Strix Point. Because remember, Strix Point is only using 7,500 megatransfers RAM, running around 90 gigabytes a second, actual benchmarks from comparing how much bandwidth is going to the GPU, right? Just testing GPU bandwidth, we're looking at 90 gigabytes versus around 102 gigabytes a second for Lunarlake. So around a 10% performance increase on memory bandwidth, and we're kind of seeing that, right? 5% better on averages, 10% better on 1 percentile, 7% better on 0.1 percentile. That is basically the bottom line here. Pushing more wattage into these platforms is not going to amount to anything. We literally have a memory bandwidth problem. And what you're seeing here is even with Lunarlake using less power, that performance increase is just coming from that memory bandwidth increase. So that's kind of capping over the gaming benchmarks here. Largely, it's a very good result for Lunarlake almost across the board. There are still a few key titles that are better on AMD, and Lunarlake in its driver problem still has some teething problems, much like Meteorlake did. I was not able to launch Batman Arkham Knight like I wasn't able to on Meteorlake at first, but that was later fixed. So likely it's going to be later fixed on Lunarlake as well. But generally speaking, we still have these odds and ends that Intel needs to fix, and just general game dev, targeting the platform and trying to make it better. So really good result from Lunarlake overall. There's nothing really bad I can say. It's just a solid chip overall, soup to nuts, CPU, GPU side, just a fantastic chip. So can I recommend the Asus Zenbook S14 with Lunarlake? 100%. Like, there's no question about it. Intel is back. They've done a fantastic job. The chipset overall from CPU and GPU is very performant and scales amazingly well. This is just like how Intel Tiger Lake used to be. It scales very well at super low power, does sensational low power, but it also has the legs and goes all the way up to 30 watt with no problem and scales linearly. This is such a nice thing to see from Intel, and it feels like a return to form for them. So I'm glad Intel is back, and I hope that they continue to push further, especially on the handheld side, which a lot of you probably recognize me from. I would like Intel to go bigger on memory bandwidth and bigger on GPU, even though I think the GPU is fairly big already. But definitely getting us more on bandwidth side is going to be something that I think Intel should lean on, especially making something like a kind of Lunarlake is already more of a handheld chip than anything that AMD is doing on Strix side at this point. So I like where Intel's going. I think that I'd like them to push a little bit further, but all told, everything on this laptop, from just how it's designed, the battery life, how good Lunarlake is across all power scaling. If you were in the market for a laptop, this is something I can easily recommend. The MSRP starting out right now is a bit pricey, and that OLED and all the other nice features are going to bump up that price a little bit. If you can find this on sale, definitely include this in your search if you were looking for just a generalized mainstream laptop. Thank you very much to my YouTube channel members as well as my Patreon members. Your support really means the world to me, guys. As always, guys, I hope this video was informative. Thank you for your time, and thanks for watching.